I think if you're somebody that tells what you know to be true, and if you can back that up with, facts, evidence, personal expertise, then speaking of reliable sources, I think you go and you become that reliable source for people. And, again, that also doesn't mean that people are always going to agree with you, but sometimes people are looking for that alternative to what they know to be true.
On cam ready in three, two, one. This is Unknown to Known, an on cam ready presentation. I'm Jamie Maglietta. On today's episode, we're going to have a guest who will help you embrace your voice with journalistic integrity. I'm always saying, think like a producer, write like a journalist. And she's the perfect guest to help you do just that. We'll ask her questions about how she embraces her voice as a journalist and conservative commentator. We're talking with Victoria Churchill. You may have seen her on Forbes. She's been featured there, or Real Clear Politics. She's in an exciting moment right now because she's stepping out of this traditional journalism box and really showcasing what she has to offer on social media. She takes you along for the journey behind the stories she's writing up for the Daily Mail. And I just love that she's embracing who she is as a journalist and also as a commentator online. It's not an easy road. She's currently on this unknown to known journey, and I thought she would be a perfect guest to help you navigate, but to also start to figure out how to show up as an expert and really embrace what your audience needs as well as your voice. So, if you like the approach I'm taking with this podcast or this YouTube show, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel or follow us on your podcasting platform of choice. If you do really enjoy this content, I'd love to see you leave a comment or a review. I'm really hoping to build out episodes that help tackle the topics that you need to navigate this new media space and become an expert online. With that, let's get to my conversation with Victoria Churchill. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me today, Jamie. Great to be on with you.
And one of the things I didn't mention off the top was that you and I met on Instagram and have been kind of cheering one another on in the last few, maybe even a year at this point.
Yeah, I think that's
I feel
right
like it's
about
been
the
a while.
time when we connected. Yeah, it's definitely been a while, but that's just the power of social media and the power of showing up is that you never know who you'll be able to connect with, whether that's across the country or even across the world.
Yeah, social media has such power. And one thing I keep telling people is, it's become your town square. Before, growing up in a small town, you would go into the local market and maybe see the mayor or bump into the dentist. And they would remind you, oh, remember, you got to come in for your appointment. Or, oh, have you met this guy? We don't really have that anymore. I mean, how many people are really truly socializing in those squares these days where social media is more and more becoming that kind of like town square where you meet people. And I'm really glad that we've connected. I've loved seeing your journey from like you're on this unknown to known journey right now. So tell us a little bit about where you are and what you've been up to.
Yeah, definitely. So in my day job, I'm the US politics reporter at the Daily Mail. I cover Congress, primarily on the Senate, a little bit on the House. So I chase congressmen and senators up and down the hallways with my phone recording, asking questions. But I think that's really what I've always been about in my journey in journalism is just asking questions. I actually gave a speech a couple months ago on people that want to get into journalism as a career. And I think asking questions is one of those very core skills is figuring out the information that
Mhm.
people might want to know, but also that maybe people don't even realize that they want to know. And then by asking questions, you really move an issue or a story forward.
Yeah, and it's all about that curiosity, right? It's good that you have it. I love seeing all those moments you've had recently. I think you also interviewed JD Vance once, right?
I did. Yeah. So that was during my last job last year. I was on the campaign trail covering the campaign trail for the New York Post in the swing states. So those are the states that can go either blue or red, depending on the election cycle. And I got to travel on what was then Trump Force Two. So when they're the candidate, it's not Air Force Two or Air Force One. They've got their own planes that they travel on. And so I got the opportunity to interview him. I did, I think it was 5 stops over 2 days. It was pretty intense, but I'm really glad I got the opportunity to do that. This was actually around the time of the presidential debate. So this was actually just about a year ago. There was a presidential debate on the 10th of September, and then Vance and the travel press pool, which I was in that day, flew to New York for the 9/11 memorial commemoration. And that was really interesting because everybody was there. Trump was there, Vance was there, but the
Mm,
Democrats as well. And so this was kind of this really key moment when everybody was at the same place at the same time. But of
so
course, I
fun.
think what you will remember what came out of that debate was this Springfield, the eating the cats and eating the dogs thing. So that's actually what I got to ask JD about. So, talk about kind of advancing a narrative or asking further questions. It was interesting that I had found out that he had actually heard complaints from one of the local mayors. I believe it was the mayor of Springfield, a few months before this incident even kind of erupted into the national zeitgeist, and, talking about social media, that it really elevated across social media platforms, just that clip. And a lot of people didn't know where it came from. And so that's kind of part of my job as a journalist, is figuring out how did we get here. And so, yeah, that was what I got to ask him about.
I want to take a break from this conversation to let you know about Riverside. I've been using Riverside as my content creation platform. And if you're looking for a way to start creating long form content for YouTube or the podcasting space, consider Riverside. There's a link in the description, and you can use my code OCR15 for a discount. Also, want to let you know about brand builders. I've been using brand builders to define myself online, my frameworks, my talks, and also get that coaching I've really needed before I lay out my visibility program. So, if you're interested in personal development and branding, check out Brand Builders. And if you want to start showing up more confidently on camera, check out my visibility program. There's a link to both in the description. Now, back to the conversation. How have you been on the trail? Do you feel like you keep growing with every opportunity?
Oh, absolutely. And, that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to. And as we look towards the midterms here in
Hmm.
2026, I actually just finished up a trip in Kentucky with Rand Paul and Thomas Massey. And of course, they're Republicans, but they're the ones that will sometimes not necessarily vote in line with what the president wants or what the
Hmm.
White House wants. So that was very interesting to go and see kind of what people on the ground in Kentucky really think about their representatives. And, we did also 8 stops over like a day and a half, 30 hours driving from stop to stop all over Northern Kentucky. Despite kind of what the DC media might paint things as, I was able to go out on the ground and actually get the stories for myself. And what I saw there was that they had packed rooms of supporters at every single event, whether it was a official side event, so that was kind of more, of course, tied to their legislative business, or a campaign event. Those were some of the evening events that they participated in with their voters, and just a lot of other state legislators as well, because that's kind of one of the questions. I don't know how much your viewers are following that race, but pretty much what's happened there is that Thomas Massey in particular, because he is up this year with Congress in the House. He's, of course, up every 2 years. Rand Paul isn't up this cycle, so it's not weighing on him as much. But the president and some of his allies are spending a lot of money to try and get Massey out in the primary. And kind of one of the questions is, if he's out, who would run against him? And so it was interesting to see myself kind of the show of force of state legislators, as they would kind of be the next people up in, potentially considering a run for Congress or other higher offices, but they're all standing by him. So
Hmm.
at least for now, that question is unanswered for those people that want to see him ousted. There's really nobody even vying to try and take his place.
And politics is one of the most robust lines of journalistic work that you could be doing. I personally feel like it's constantly evolving, especially under a Trump presidency. So when you're navigating that road and trying to figure out, okay, I have to connect with these politicians, get questions answered, and also help communicate this to my audience. What do you try to do in those situations to kind of help people understand what's going on when you're writing your articles? Because I feel like there's this storytelling element that not everyone's aware of that could potentially help them if they're trying to go into this new media space and breaking down big topics so that people can really consume them. So what's your process?
Yeah, so I feel there's kind of two parts to this answer. As I've kind of discovered in recent months, reporting in Congress versus on the campaign trail is
Mhm.
quite a different set of skills and quite a different set of connections and things that you kind of leverage, I guess, in your toolbox every single day. But in Congress in particular, there's so many things that are very complicated issues, and you have to be able to distill those down to audiences, again, across the country. But of course, with the Daily Mail, we have both the UK site and a US site. And sometimes these stories especially these big international stories, they'll get pulled onto our UK site. And so you have to make sure that audiences that may not be in with kind of the nitty gritty of what's going on Capitol Hill, they still get the big picture. And so I think
Mhm.
as a journalist, you have to make sure that the nitty gritty parts of whatever legislation or whatever procedure is going on, but you are able to distill it to more general audiences,
Mhm.
which I think is definitely a skill. I mean, my stories get hundreds of thousands, if not over a million plus views a month. And that means that not every single person that is doing that is a political junkie. They just kind of want to know exactly what's going on. And so,
Mhm.
really, in my job, when I'm explaining a complex topic like, why are people upset at Secretary Bobby Kennedy? I have to be able to figure out, well, he's done all of these things and, maybe they'll get a mention later on down the article, but we want to talk about the news of the day, the exchange. And so it's kind of a balance of figuring out how much background information to give people versus how
Mhm.
much kind of subject matter expertise, I guess, you give your readers. And, readers are smart. Like, I think sometimes even politicians in their rhetoric, they'll think that their voters aren't smart. And I think that's quite insulting to a lot of people that really interact in that space. But I think that you really have to figure out this curiosity that people have and figure out how to tap into that. And again, just, I feel like it's it's really like a cookbook or a recipe that you're following. You don't want to add too much sugar, too much flour, too much eggs to make your cake. And it's a skill. It's really a skill that you have to develop day in and day out. And I think for the purposes of your audience, also, it's a balance of showcasing your expertise, but also figuring out how much your audience can absorb and what their capacity for absorbing that information is.
One of the things I usually will say is you need to know who you are, how you can provide value, and who your audience is and what they're looking for, because that's the way you can really truly connect. Now, that doesn't mean you have to give them a slanted opinion, send them misinformation because that's what they're looking for. What it means is thinking like a producer and a journalist and being thoughtful with how you are presenting your case or your point of view online. And, while we're on this topic, do you have any tips on how people can think journalistically when they're putting together a story? Say someone wants to share an opinion about a headline of yours that they read and they have the background and they want to start leaning into maybe commenting on politics. What do they really need to make sure that they aren't spewing misinformation or disinformation or misleading people as they're showing up as experts online?
Yeah, again, I think really any headline, you can spin it either to the left or to the right
Yeah.
or to really fit whatever agenda you want. And so I think you really need to figure out, if this is an information that's a primary source, figure out even why that reporter included that, or if it's a secondary source, because sometimes we'll see things reported in another outlet and then we'll take the bits and pieces of it that we think our audience is most interested in. So, for example, just yesterday, I was writing an article about the shutdown that's happening, and there was some polling that the Washington Post had done, and they had spun it one way, that basically they were saying, like, based on their polling, which was 1,000 individuals they polled from across the country, that Trump and Republicans were to blame for the shutdown. And then, kind of further down beyond that headline, they break down some numbers. And so
Mm.
some numbers that I pulled into our audience was, it's interesting that, for example, out of independents, there was an X percentage of them that did blame Democrats and another percentage that blamed Republicans. But I think for our audience, because we do really pull from both sides of the aisle, which I think is pretty unique in this media landscape that we're in, I think more of our audience would relate to that number than just a top line. This is what people think. Our audience might want to know why. And so I was able to provide those additional numbers and pull out additional data. But, again, that was still 500-word article versus the original Washington Post article was 1,000 or 1,500, and it really went into the nitty-gritty of the data. Again, my knowledge base was that, and I
Mhm.
went through and I looked at all of those statistics, and then I pulled out the ones that I thought were gonna be most relevant.
Yeah, and that's important. It's always trying to figure out what's most relevant. And then, as she was saying earlier, really trying to water it down a little bit so that your audience truly can grasp it and understand and keep going with you along this journey of whatever story you're trying to lay out for them to understand. Besides being the US political reporter, you're also a conservative commentator. You've been featured on Real Clear Politics, The American Conservative. I also think I saw you in Forbes. So let's talk about that. As a reporter and now leaning into the commentating space. What happened that made you say, okay, I want to start being more open about my opinions?
Yeah, so for me, I guess it was actually a little bit backwards because I had been in commentary spaces really even since I was in college. And I think one other element that I think really makes me a good and a unique reporter is that I've actually worked in politics and I've worked
Mhm.
particularly in grassroots and on campaigns. And so I think kind of above all, I'll talk in political spaces, but I think really overall my expertise is grassroots politics. And again, because I've done it and now I'm also reporting on it. And so I think for me, really leveraging that because I think a lot of people, they might have grown up in, I don't know, New York, and then they went to college in Pennsylvania, and now they live in DC. And so their worldview is pretty small. They haven't traveled. I grew up on the West Coast and I lived in the Midwest. I went to college at the University of Kansas, and then I lived in Iowa for a couple of years as well as a campaign staffer. So, I think a lot of people really have a narrow minded, like, especially a lot of reporters in DC, they don't really have, I think, that grassroots expertise that really knows how to talk to a large swath of the population, which I think I bring to the table. And so that's what we were talking about just now with the headlines. I think so much of DC, New York, they revolve around these headlines and they don't
Mhm.
really know what a lot of those mean to the average voter, the average person. Again, I think that's one of my distinguishing characteristics is that I know how to do that because I've gone door to door. I've had conversations with voters and they'll be like, I'm door knocking for this congressional candidate. And they'll be like, can you fix my potholes? And I'm like, well, that's not really what Congress does, but have you heard about XYZ? Or, do you care about this issue? Or what's your thoughts on this? And, those are really eye opening conversations. And I've had thousands of them over the years, before I became a reporter. And, again, I think really being that kind of, I don't want to say filter, but really making those connections and being kind of that bridge, I think is where I thought my expertise could be. And so, I'll comment on kind of other like global issues now, but my bread and butter, at least the way that I view it, is really politics and especially electoral politics.
And, some people may think, well, does that make your reporting biased? And here's what I'll say every reporter, every journalist, they have their own political view and they come into it as trying to be as neutral and independently as possible. Like you're not coming in and saying, well, I'm a conservative, so we have to spin it conservatively. No, as a journalist, you're coming in with, sure, you may be looking at it from a different angle than others, but that also helps you see their point of view too. Wouldn't you say that having your point of view then helps you frame stories a certain way that maybe helps the audience see all sides?
Yeah, I would say that. And again, I also think that just because of my background, a lot of my value add to a lot of stories is talking about some different factions that are present within the political right, because that's where I have spent a decade plus myself. And I think somebody that has never been in that space can't necessarily figure out those nuances or those intricacies as well as I can. And so there's probably a lot of other people that are journalists more on the left side of the media and
Mhm.
they can talk about those intricacies on the political left a lot better than I can. But again, I think really in any industry, you have to figure out your value add. What do you bring to the table that
Mhm.
no one or a few other people, but hopefully no one else does? And so, for me, I know what that is. And of course, I'm always looking to expand, just since starting this job a few months ago, I definitely realized that I have to, get better sources on the Democrat side of things and, in liberal groups. And that's something that I think is valuable because I know that it will make my reporting and my storytelling better. But, again, kind of leaning into your strengths, I think is very natural. And for
Mhm.
people that are looking to get into commentary, there will be some subject matter that you are an expert in and that very few people can bring to the table.
Mhm.
I think that is out there for everybody. It's just owning it and finding it and using that to build your name, to build your brand. So far, that's what's been successful for me. I don't know what it'll look like in a few years, but so far it's working.
Good. And so, what have been some of the biggest internal barriers you might have wrestled with when you were thinking about starting to turn the camera around on yourself and being more public?
Yeah, it is because I am a print journalist day to day. I think in this day more than ever, it's so much more important to have your face tied to your words and your writing online. And I think for a lot of people, they can't really bridge that gap. And so that's definitely something that I've been conscious of tying my voice and my face to my words. I think it takes a lot, but I also think it's very valuable because I think that the people that do that consistently are able to grow through the ranks because people know that that individual who, they might see on TV, they can connect that to really solid commentary work on TV, but then also to really solid reporting. And I think that they'll go and they'll seek that out.
I wanted to break away again for a quick tip. If you're serious about getting press, producers don't always just find you. You need the right people pitching your story. You need the right people in your corner supporting you. That's why I recommend Grisco Group. They know how to take your expertise and turn it into headlines. There's a link in my description. And if you reach out, mention my name, Jamie, so they know I sent you. Now back to the conversation. What I'm seeing is more experts are showing up on social media and trying to get people from the scroll to go to their articles or go to their YouTube channel or get out of this platform to see their long form work. What role do you see social media playing? Video or, just those photos, carousels and video in social media. How do you think it's playing? And do you feel it's important for more journalists to show up in the scroll if they want to keep getting the type of views you get on your articles?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think anytime that you can kind of interlink, different audiences across platforms is very valuable. I'll post sometimes, especially if it's something more career oriented and, I'm talking at this event or this and that, or I just went to this, conference, I'll post that across LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook and X. And I feel like it's seen by completely different audiences. And so, I think especially if you have something where social media is not kind of your primary way of making money or your primary kind of medium of communicating with people, you've already done the hard part somewhere else. And so, it's maybe an extra 10% or an extra 20% of effort to really broaden that reach and broaden that scope. And so, like if I've just wrapped up writing an article and I'm really tired and I'm like, well, I don't have to tweet it. And I'm like, okay, it's going to take me 3 seconds to tweet it. And it opens it up to potentially being seen by millions of people. And I think that's really important. And actually, before I joined the Daily Mail, one of the things that I was really attracted to this media outlet in particular is because they recognize the value of social media. And I think
Mhm.
not all longtime outlets do. But, it's right now, I think the Daily Mail, in terms of news outlets, it's the most followed news outlet on TikTok. And so they're really grasping onto that younger audience because they realize that younger audience might not necessarily have the app downloaded, or they might not necessarily have the subscription. In the US, we don't have a physical paper. In the UK, we do have a physical paper. But, I pretty much guarantee you that the people looking at the Daily Mail TikTok are a completely different audience. And so that just broadens your reach, it broadens your scope, and it broadens your impact. And, I think as a journalist, you have to capitalize on all those mediums and, you don't have to be an expert in all of them. Like social media, again, like I say, it's maybe 10 or 20% of what I'll do on a day-to-day basis. But I think that extra 10 or 20% is really what keeps your career growing and keeps your network growing. And I think the other point that I want to point out, and you'll know this because I've watched your journey, but of course your audience is, it's not overnight. Like I've been particularly in the commentary space. I've been there for almost a decade.
Mhm.
And so, I want to say like slow burn, I think is the best approach, especially when it comes to commentary. If there's something that you feel very passionately about, go ahead and, kind of let it rip and let that out there. But, if it's something you're maybe waffling on or something you may not be super sure about, what I always say is you don't have to have a hot take on everything because it's better to pause and, maybe skip that opportunity than have something go wrong because your brand takes, years or decades to build, but it can vanish in, a tweet, right? Like it can vanish in, 10 seconds if you do something wrong. So my advice is to, go out there, be confident and talk about the things that you know how to talk about. But if you don't, if you were to interview me on something super intricate foreign policy wise or some super, I don't know, intricate economic thing, like I might not necessarily be the person to tell you about that. If you ask me, how does Congress feel about that? I can tell you because I can tell you, oh, this person voted this way and this person voted this way. But if you talk to me about the merits of the policies, I might not necessarily be your go-to person. And so, again, that also goes to knowing your expertise. And if I was asked to come on as a guest for a show and something that was more foreign policy, I could tell you, well, this reflects the split in the parties because this person is supporting this. But, when it comes to Israel and Ukraine, there's this bipartisan group that's been over there. And, here's the people that are leading on that issue. And so,
Mm.
that's a way of leveraging my expertise of knowing who
Yeah.
believes what without actually getting my own personal views out there.
But that also brings up a really good point that would be worth us discussing is when you're preparing to be on camera, do you lay out your potential talking points and how you would go about saying what you might want to say about the questions you may get thrown? How do you prepare for your on camera moments?
Yeah. So most of the time, thankfully, producers, as you know, having been a producer, will email guests some potential topics. Now, this isn't always a guarantee of what's going to get talked about, especially if you're in something that's more of a live news situation. You may get something thrown at you. So, again, in that situation, just know what you know, but also know what you don't know. So don't go into that territory that you don't know. And but yeah, so if you do have a list of topics, I think that's very good. Go ahead and look at the context again behind it, right? Because we're just talking about earlier, you have your headlines and you know what everybody knows about it, but just going and doing that kind of one level deeper dig into a story, I think that can pay dividends. Like, for example, just this past weekend, I was on a show. It was a 2-hour taped show, broadcast live, and then the outlet pulled clips from it. And, they're saying, here's this viral moment that's all across social media. What do you think about it? And I'll be like, well, that's the moment that everybody else saw, but I actually did a little bit of reading and I can tell you how it happened. And so I was able to provide, as a journalist, right, like that additional context on something. And I think that just being that extra level of critical or that extra level of expertise that just,
Yeah.
gives you so much more grounding than 99% of people that will have just seen that, 10-second viral clip that's gone around.
And the point that she's also making here is to also know your segue, your word to get out of something, your way of transitioning to what you really want to be able to talk about. So I was recently on a podcast and it felt like it was getting political and I kept getting, so what do you think? And I'm like, well, I can tell you what TikTok is saying right now, and I can show you that this is actually resonating really well on this space. It's all about trying to position yourself so that you're still being able to leverage your expertise without moving into an area that maybe you don't want to talk about or maybe you're not that knowledgeable about. Have you ever had those tricky situations and had any like cringe moments or do you have any pieces of advice that people might take away from this to help them when they're given a question they don't really want to answer?
Yeah, how I was taught to do this in media appearances, it's called the block and bridge. I don't know if this is something that you teach your students, but that's how I was taught it. So, if you're asked something that you're not comfortable with, basically you put a block on it and then you bridge it to something that you're much more comfortable talking about. So, for example, in my case, more in the political space, polling is a great way to do that. So, say my generation is Gen Z, and here's what the latest poll on X issue says Gen Z believes. That's a really easy way
Mhm.
because, again, knowing your strengths, right? And I think this has changed more in the past couple of years, but, a lot of the times being the youngest person on a panel or youngest person in the room, that's just kind of an easy out, easy expertise. But, like even on the show that I was on last week, there's the host who I'm pretty sure is a millennial. The other guest that I was kind of dueling with, he is a much older gentleman and, I'm the young woman on the panel. And so, I can say X% of women believe that this is the case, or, X% of Gen Z women believe that this is the case. So that's a very easy way of, really being the voice of your generation or the voice of your, I don't want to say, of course, you speak for everybody, but, again, that's very easy because a lot of the times those other people might not necessarily even be thinking about that.
And even as a trend, if you see someone talking about a topic and everyone's starting to talk about it and you're trying to think, well, I need to try to get in on this. as she said earlier, maybe take a beat and figure out like, can you really, should you really? And if you were to, how would you approach it so that you're still staying true to your expertise and the brand that you're building? It's important to stay true to who you are and also have the long game in mind, which is what you clearly have, which I love seeing. Where it seems like you know where you want to go. Do you have that vision for yourself?
That's an interesting question. It's actually something that I ask myself a lot. I think, again, that long game is really the key that you have to
Mhm.
think about because I say, 15 years ago or 10 years ago when I was just, I'd say I started getting into politics and media, knowing that I wanted to do something in that space about 15 years ago. And then, 10 years ago, I decided to go to college and I wanted to, go to a journalism school, but also be somewhere where I could have political internships. And so, those were all thoughts that I had. And I didn't know exactly what space I was or exactly what role I was going to be in this space, but I always knew I wanted to, live out in DC and I wanted to do something between politics and media. So I think having that kind of large goal is good, but knowing that each individual step that you take, it's not a directly linear path. It might be, maybe you've seen like on social media, people think that the journey is like this, but it's not like it's all jumbled and you might go back 3 steps and then you go zigzag and then, in the end, you're still trending upwards, but it's not a linear path. And so, again, for me, like that was working on political campaigns and, figuring out that I've helped other people build their voice, but at the end of the day, I wanted to kind of have my reputation ride on myself and not, stupid decisions that politicians might make. And so, I don't count that as like wasted time or anything. Cause again, my expertise is still politics. And so time that I spent being in the political space has contributed to that overall expertise. At the end of the day, it's, maybe I thought I was going to be more of a, an Olivia Pope, a fixer, right? Like I used to be obsessed with the show Scandal. And so, maybe my life looks like that in the fact that, I live in DC and I sometimes wear suits to work, but I'm not the fixer. I'm the person in front of the camera sometimes. I think having an overall goal is good, but figuring out kind of those in between things, that's where, I'd say be willing to see opportunities that come your way. And, I'm always that person that will apply for that fellowship. I'll apply for a job. If I'm looking for a new job, I'll apply for something that might not necessarily be the thing where I think I'll necessarily be next. But just a few months ago, after working for the New York Post on the campaign trail, that was a temporary job. And so I spent the first few months of this year looking for a new job. And, again, I applied for opportunities that would have put me kind of more behind the scenes. I applied for other opportunities. And, for me, that's just always a way of keeping doors open. I think if something isn't for you, that door will close itself, but you can't be the person that closes that door, I think is the way that I want to put it. And so I'm always going to networking events and going to conferences and applying for fellowships and, doing this, that, and the other that I think can, grow my brand, expand my network. And so I think for you as an individual, you want to open as many doors. And then, if the universe or, for people that are believers, like if God closes that door or if somebody closes that door, then it's not for you. But I think for you as an individual, you threw that out there. And then beyond that, kind of whatever happens, happens.
And if you really want it, you can always try to find that back door. But being a journalist and then sharing your opinion publicly, sometimes trolling and criticism comes along with that. Have you faced any of that, becoming more public about your opinions? I know you're saying you've had commentary throughout your career, but I feel like you're taking more of a larger approach to it now, more public
Yeah.
approach. Yeah.
I'm definitely not the first person to say this, but I've always heard and been told that if you don't get criticism, that means you're not standing for anything. And so just taking a stand, whether you say you like blueberries more than raspberries, you will have people that love raspberries that will come after you and being like, why do you hate raspberries? And, if you say that blueberries are terrible and that you want oranges, the blueberry people are going to come after you and say, well, haven't you considered the amazing antioxidant benefits of blueberries? Like, how can you only be eating oranges? Oranges are terrible. You have to open up the peel and it sprays everywhere. Being like, okay, well, with an orange, you can put it in your bag and it can sit there all day. Just having an opinion on fruit, right? People get really fired up. And so when you take that into the political realm, you'll have 50% of people that disagree with you. on any issue. And so I think intrinsically by taking a stand on anything, you will have people that oppose you. You will have, I don't want to say enemies, but you will have people that get very fired up. And I think just putting yourself out there
Mhm,
inherently welcomes people to disagree with you.
mhm,
But I was a debate kid in high school, so I've always been about engagement. I've always been about debate. Somebody that is a conservative commentator. I grew up in primarily liberal areas. I grew up in the Seattle area, and I went to high school in California. And even though I went to college in Kansas, which is a pretty red state, even though right now it has a Democrat governor, just being on a college campus, being in a college town, and just the town itself. They used to call it the blueberry and the tomato soup. It was the liberal spot in a pretty red state. And so really, I think anywhere that I've been kind of that loyal opposition. And, I think for me, it's made me stronger in my arguments. It's made me stronger in my beliefs, and it's really strengthened my worldview as well.
mhm. I love that. Do you ever have an approach you take for negative comments?
I think a lot of the time people just, again, parrot talking points and they don't look at the deeper level behind anything. If they hear a personality saying something, they just take that as fact. They don't necessarily always have criticisms or a way to critique whatever that argument is. And so, again, this goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, asking questions. People will be like, well, you lied on this headline. I'll be like, well, what's the lie? And then literally just asking them that question. A lot of the times they either don't answer or they don't have an answer, or they'll just repeat whatever their insult was. And it's like, well, if you actually want to say, well, actually, this is true. Okay. Like maybe I missed something, right? Like sometimes in journalism, we're putting out 3, 4, 5 stories a day. Sometimes a story takes 5 hours. Sometimes it takes 40 minutes. We're all human. And, of course, on that piece of writing, there's been 3 or 4 sets of eyes on it. But yes, things do get missed in the media. And so if you bring me a piece of evidence that's contrary to what I published, like I might consider that. And,
Mhm.
newspapers make corrections all the time.
Yeah.
But if you just come at me with insults, I'll ask you that question. And, if you just keep insulting me, like at one point I'll stop engaging, or I'll keep asking you that question. I'll be like, so what actually is the lie? What's wrong with this?
I love
That's my advice.
I love your mindset on this. When I was on Reliable Sources, I started to get trolled. And I remember getting messages and, some of my tweets, I would tweet something and then I would delete it because I wanted to fix like how I wrote it. I was copy editing it and I was like, oh, shoot, I should delete that and repost it. I messed up a word. And I started to have this guy be like, "I saw you delete that. Don't worry. I took a picture of the first one." And I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, like I'm being watched." So many people don't know how to handle that negative criticism. And when you are sharing your opinion, you do need to have that thick skin, right? They always say, like, you need to be able to just say, okay, I'm not going to let this bother me. I'm going to just roll with it. And the one thing I also learned from all that was you need to also stand behind what you're doing. And the only way you can is if you have facts, if you have stats and details to really support your opinion, to really help you shape your point of view online so that you have legs to stand on when you are feeling attacked.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, facts, but also I think having your own personal experiences. So again, when I'm campaign reporting and I say, well, I talked to X voter in, Erie, Pennsylvania, and here's what they told me. And, if that DC newsroom or that New York newsroom doesn't have that perspective, I'm also not all the time sharing my own perspective, but
Mhm.
sharing my own expertise because I've been out there, I've talked to people on the field, here's what they told me. And so I think that of course, bringing my own experience and expertise, I think is valid, but also backing that up with other people's, I think is even more valid because I'm saying, well, you think this policy isn't going to sell well, but here we go. Like, here's the voters that I've talked to and here's what they've told me. And, I've printed it in my work. And so, a lot of the times if there's somebody that just, lives in DC or lives in New York and they don't really get out much and, travel like I do all the time, uh, that brings that perspective, right? You're talking about on the program, bringing that perspective that you think isn't being considered. I think that's my way of doing that.
I love it. So, do you have any final thoughts to help people as they're on their path to going from unknown to known and navigating this new media space as an expert?
Yeah, I think definitely just again putting yourself out there, not everything's going to go crazy. Not everything's going to go viral if that's your goal, but also just don't do things just for the shot of being viral, because you also don't want to be known for the wrong thing. And, I think if you're somebody that tells what you know to be true, and if you can back that up with, like you said, facts, evidence, personal expertise, then speaking of reliable sources, I think you go and you become that reliable source for people. And, again, that also doesn't mean that people are always going to agree with you, but sometimes people are looking for that alternative to what they know to be true. And, again, this can be in a lot of different spaces. Like, just for fun, I interact with a lot of financial content. There's a lot of that on TikTok and Instagram. And, there's some creators who, I may not agree with on everything, but there's probably 4 or 5 that I watch. And between the 5 of them, I'll figure out bits and pieces that I think are valid, and, some things that I won't necessarily embrace into my own life. But
Mhm.
I think that really speaks to this new media, because so much of traditional media, I think people would just watch one channel all day. But because of new media and everything being so bite sized, you can have, 4 or 5, 6 different sources or creators or individuals that you go to. And to me, I think, I've talked before about just this democratized media environment. And so, for them, if they're reading my article that's 500 words, that might be one of 5 or 6 articles that they read on a topic, on a story, on the news of the day. And so, for me, I just, really see myself as just one player in the space. But I think that, if my voice goes away, I think there's a void. And so, that's what encourages me to keep showing up and keep being out there. Because again, you're not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but if you can have somebody view something a different way, I think that's a win in my book.
It is. And everyone, if you're enjoying this conversation, be sure to find Victoria on Instagram. I'll have her links below in the description so you can connect with her and read more about what she's writing about and find her online. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Great to be on with you again.